All right, let's try this again. We're trying to get this. We're talking about Jade Helm. There, he's going on to tell you that Russia and our Congress voted to supply weapons to Kyiv. And this Jade, making it look like Jade Helm 15 is not just a drill. Chechnya is planning on sending weapons to the insurgents in America. That would be the Mexicans, wouldn't it?
I think it's up here.
And
this move by Russia is following the response path of a, quote, eye for an eye. Historically, America annexed the now U.S. states of California, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, and Wyoming. And that's according to this guy right here. I can't pronounce his name. It's very, very hard for me to pronounce. It's right. He is Speaker Duka. I don't even know. Said resolution of the U.S. Congress which calls on Obama to supply weapons to Georgia. U.S. House of Representatives said Monday passed a resolution, the text of which calls for U.S. President Barack Obama to send weapons to Kiev. For this decision, 348 congressmen spoke against 48. 348 approved the bill, and Humvees have already started arriving in Kiev. There is no telling of what Russia's response will be, but if you guys recall correctly what Putin said, he said that that is pretty much a declaration of war. That's just another straws that broke the camel's back. Another one of the straws they could have chosen to break the camel's back. Now we've begun that. The House of Representatives urged President USA fully and immediately take advantage of the powers given to Congress and to provide Ukraine with defensive weapon systems to enhance the possibility of the Ukrainian people to defend its sovereign territory, said in the document. Chairman of the Parliament of the Czech Republic, Duka Vaka, I'm not even going to try, commented the news and turned to American colleagues. Dear members of the Congress of the United States of America, from U.S. citizens often hear about the exclusivity of the U.S. Constitution. Sorry, it keeps popping up with the Russian translation. According to your basic law, everyone has the right to freedom of expression. No political speech should ban only on the grounds that is in favor of one side and not the other. None of the citizens can not be forbidden to act only because they stated their opinion is false or dangerous, said the Supreme Court is in one of its decisions interpreting the U.S. Constitution. Meanwhile, your words with your own actions for believing in a false American freedom of speech suffered Bradley Manning, Edward Snowden, Julian Assange, and many others. We cannot be happy with that the U.S. government takes all sorts of overt measures aimed at destabilizing the political situation in the neighboring Russian state, promotes NATO to the east. All actions in Europe and the United States at the Russian borders are unacceptable, and so rapid expansion of the West, NATO enlargement, is in fact a manifestation of aggression. The Soviet Union, to fight in which was founded by the alliance, has died in August 1991. Did die in 1991. So what then is the purpose of NATO? And anyway, what is it still there? Why is it still there? In history, there were many precedents. When the supply of U.S. weapons in certain troubled spots of the world does not help resolve conflict, but on the contrary, leads to a multiple increase in casualties among the illegal proliferation of gang and terrorist groups to an escalation of conflict. Let's look at the results of the post-Soviet NATO activities. Millions of civilians, and you can go on to read all this. I'm not going to read it all. I'm looking for the important part, which is down towards the bottom. Hang on, I got to find it again. I often wonder what interest haunts America and Ukraine, representatives of our country, to protect the country from invaders. More than 3.5 million of our soldiers died defending the Ukrainian lands from Nazi invaders. At the same time, some NATO generals, often in Kiev today, were representatives of countries that were once allied with the army of the Third Reich War, including the Ukrainian people. In the USSR, past the Ukrainian state, together with the Ukrainians in the development of post-war Union, Republic worked Russian, Georgians, Chechens, Armenians, and Jews. None of the U.S. dollar has been spent on the reconstruction and development of Ukraine after the Second World War. Moscow and Kiev, since ancient times, built statehood together against Russian and Ukrainian peoples, today are fraternal. It follows that the United States has no right to advise Russia to behave with neighboring friendly people. Supply of arms to Ukraine will be perceived by us as a signal to the appropriate actions. We will begin delivery of new weapons to Mexico to resume debate on the legal status of the territories annexed by the United States, which are now the U.S. states of California, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, and Wyoming. We reserve the right to perform in Russia, Mexico, America conferences with questions raised about the separation of the above-mentioned state of the United States and delivery of weapons to the guerrillas there. They're going to deliver weapons to America, to insurgents inside of America, to guerrillas inside of America. What's the main problem? Our border is wide open. We've been getting invaded for months with foreign troops. It's been years. They've infiltrated parts of our entire country. Just to verify, this is the Moscow Times. Chechnya threatens to send weapons to Mexico if U.S. arms Ukraine. March 26, 2015. This is very verified. Obviously, this is another part of their plan or their play to bring down the United States of America. A Kremlin spokesman reminded Russia's Republic of Chechnya that it is illegal for Russian regions to send weapons abroad after the Chechen parliament threatened to supply arms to Mexico for it to fight the United States. Which means, guess what? It's going on. When I first read this line, I actually thought that they were talking about Cuba or Venezuela, not parts of Mexico. But that's what I was just thinking. That's why we declared a national emergency with Venezuela. Because right after that, Russia and China started doing major drills in Venezuela. The Chechen parliament made the statement in response to a U.S. congressional resolution that called for sending lethal military aid to Ukraine. Clearly, this is on the table. Obviously, they're going to try and cover it up and say, no, we can't do that. It's illegal. How many actions do world leaders take that are illegal around the country, around the world, excuse me? Innumerous. Clearly, with Jade Helm lining directly up with where Russia is planning to supply weapons, this is alarming. We might actually have to get ready for martial law. I will leave this link. It's got a ton of information in it. It's also the translation of what I just read to you. This link here is also in the bottom of this one here, so I'll leave the link. This is obviously to the main website, freedomfighterreports.com. This is massive. This is explosive. Because literally, supply weapons to guerrillas in those states. Think about that.
And it ain't the militias that they're talking about supplying the weapons to. Now, let's go on to Professor Kevin B. MacDonald, talking about the psychological mechanism of white dispossession. They want to give the southern states back to Mexico. Get us whites out.
Okay, yeah. It's great to be here. It's a beautiful venue, and it's so nice to see so many people on board with all these ideas. As we all know, we are a small minority, but we do have as Forty was saying, we talk about the moral high ground. This is critical, I think, to the success, the eventual success of our movement. So what I want to talk about today, actually, Forty asked you to talk about these things, psychological mechanisms related to our dispossession. And as I just saying, the moral intellectual high ground in the West is occupied by these hostile elites. And they dominate the media, and they can punish dissenters. I've been talking to people, it certainly has occurred in Sweden, it's occurred in the United States and elsewhere in Europe. People with dissident views, people with views like ours, oftentimes can't say that in public. We will lose our jobs. We will be ostracized. It happens all the time in America. Somebody will call attention to Jewish power, or they'll say something about blacks that they're less intelligent or something. So they'll blurt out something like that, and next thing you know, they've lost their job. And of course, it's a huge disincentive for other people. It's a huge example, and that's exactly what happens. So within this context, it's the self-interest of whites to basically sell out their own people, to go along with the current regime. And so you see, people like us who, we're just white Europeans, and we have these very public displays of white guilt, of how bad white culture is, how good immigration is, multiculturalism, diversity. If you want a job at a university, especially as an administrator, I can't even imagine getting a job like that without pledging allegiance to diversity, pledging allegiance to multiculturalism, talking about how you want to increase diversity of the student body, and so on. That's sort of what you have to do to get those kinds of jobs. That's what's necessary for career advancement. In short, our dispossession is massively incentivized. I mean that there are huge incentives for doing this. I was just talking to Ricardo Duchesne. He was talking about Charles Taylor. Charles Taylor just received a grant of $1.5 million, a personal grant, for his wonderfulness in service of multiculturalism. Dr. Duchesne is not going to get a grant like that. He's not going to get that kind of academic acclaim. He's not going to get that kind of money. And that's the reality. So, white academics in America, throughout the West, and it's true in the media and pretty much all jobs now, people know what they have to say to get ahead, and it is massively incentivized. So within psychology, one of the common theories is what's called social learning theory. People learn from models. But the point is that models are more effective if they have prestige and high status. So we pay more attention to people who have power, people who are rich and have money and so on. And this very much is part of our evolved psychology, that we sort of look up to people who have power, who are attractive in various ways. So propaganda is far more effective. It's promoted by elites that are seen as legitimate, as okay. And so these academic and media institutions are seen as legitimate. Within the United States, especially with universities like Harvard, other Ivy League universities, it's very common to read newspaper articles about immigration or diversity, and you'll quote a professor, at Columbia or Harvard or something like that to make the point. So you have these prestigious people in prestigious media saying these things. Well, the average person does not think he's some kind of intellectual genius. They admire that. They accept that. They want to emulate that. They want to be seen with a copy of the Washington Post and New York Times. They want to be able to talk about these high-level book review journals and so on. That is a sign of intelligence and education. It's really a huge marker of status in all Western societies that you are part of this educated elite. You understand these things. You're plugged into the same intellectual circles as Harvard, the New York Times, and so on.
All right, hold on just a moment. I want to bring you something from my Friday guest, Russell Pappalardo. Russell Pappalardo. Yeah, let's go, Russell.
Hello, friends. This is RJ, the mighty Phoenix. Friends, if you're a business owner and need capital to sustain or accentuate your business, and if you've been in business for 2 years or more, and your credit scores are low as 500, I can help you. Credit scores don't pay back with money that you borrow. Credit scores are only weapons being used against you in the war on small business. You pay back money that you borrow with business monies earned. So if you have 6 recent bank statements and your business is active, and as I said, you've been in business for over 2 years, I can get you money within 8 business days. contact me at R, as in Russell, J as in James, P as in Peter, P as in Peter again, A as in author, P as in Peter again, A as in author, at yahoo.com. That's R, J, P, P, A, P, A at yahoo.com. And if you're not in business and you need to earn extra cash and you don't want to go out and work for someone who's going to take advantage of you, or you don't want to spend the money to gas and get paid minimum wage, you can work with me, not for me, and earn big commissions. And all you need to do is place ads on the computer, on the internet, on Craigslist, on Backpage, on other sites, in the financial section. Only 15 minutes a day. Again, contact me at rjppapa@yahoo.com. Leave your cell phone number. I'll get back to you within 24 hours. And we'll discuss the issue. I can help you. Again, rjppapa@yahoo.com. Have a great day, folks.
All right. You're back with the Free American. I am Clay Douglas. Professor Kevin B. MacDonald at the University of Southern California at Long Beach is talking about the psychological mechanism of white dispossession. We are being moved out of our own country, especially if you're in California, Texas, the Southwest.
And immigration within that, multiculturalism, is a consensus value among these elites. Opposing it is a sign that you are uneducated and morally defective in some way. So, and Hollywood has had, 40 years, and I'm sure you've seen some of these movies, at least 40 years, where people who are, who have ideas that conflict with this kind of zeitgeist are seen as stupid. In America we had a TV show called Archie Bunker and All in the Family. He was seen as, stupid, as morally defective and uneducated. He'd always had bad grammar. He didn't know basic geography. He had probably been to the 4th grade or something. Those are the kind of people who were saying, who were concerned about, saying things about blacks or Jews or opposed to immigration. So it's something that only stupid people do, only morally evil people do. And that message has been coming down from these elite circles for 40, 50, 60 years in America, and I think throughout the rest pretty much. So my book, The Culture of Critique, really that is a major theme, that these Jewish intellectual movements had access to the most prestigious academic institutions. If you look at the various groups that I talked about in the book, to talk about the Boasian anthropologists. They were really throughout academia. He had students that ended up, chairing anthropology departments at the University of California, University of Chicago, Columbia, all the big universities. Their anthropology departments were dominated by his students. If you look at these universities like Harvard, Columbia. If you look at anti-biologism, people like Stephen Jay Gould at Harvard, this guy Lewontin, very important he was the guy that had the idea that whites have no interest. Nobody has any biological interest. That there are no differences really that are worth mentioning between races. There are differences within race that's far, far bigger than that and so on. A completely fallacious argument, but he was at Harvard. He was a smart guy. And so people saluted that, and they still do that. Frankfurt schools at Columbia, the University of California, at Berkeley, these neocons now that are so important in influencing American foreign policy, big bases at the University of Chicago and Johns Hopkins. The success of these movements has not been based on their data, how rigorous they are intellectually and anything else. They were based on ethnic networking. That is really the major theme of cultural critique. It's about ethnic networking and becoming part of this the top level, taking over the top levels of the society. This has been a top-down revolution. It's not been bottom-up. People have not demanded, you haven't had a demand by the people for more immigration. It's a top-down thing and always has been. So the control of these institutions at the top of the society has always been critical to its success. Once this value set was institutionalized, once the left really got ensconced in these universities, then it became the focus of status competition. If you wanted to be successful as an academic, you got along with that. You started, writing publications that fit with that point of view. That would make you a better job candidate. It would get you a job at a better university. It would get you tenure and all that. And once this happens, once these institutions get dominated by a particular point of view, there's a huge inertia, and we see that now. Throughout the social sciences and the humanities departments, the English, the arts, but all the social sciences, sociology, psychology, and so on, they're dominated by the left, and they're very politically motivated. And it's very hard to change that because, there's a consensus there, and they actually keep people out. So aspiring academics, if you're an undergraduate student, you see this, you see how it works, you aspire to that. So there's very strong pressure to adopt these values of the discipline. For example, the idea that race is a social construct, that whites didn't exist until the 18th century, or some silly thing like that. But that is something that is, now accepted. It's like a dogma in the social sciences. And of course, it is associated with prestigious universities. You can find professors at Harvard saying these sorts of things, and then people salute that. Because those institutions have so much prestige, people look up to them. They want to emulate those people. On the other hand, conservatives are turned off, and they're simply not going to go to graduate school. Or if because they've seen this, they're not in tune with it. They can see that they're not going to be accepted, or they're simply going to be flunked out. They're going to be discouraged from continuing. There's actually an academic paper on why are professors liberal. That's really the message there, that conservatives are kept out, that they won't be hired. And when you go to a hiring interview, they're going to see where you are politically. And even if they manage to hire somebody, who's not really on board with their stuff, they got 6 years in America before they can give you before you have to give you tenure. They'll figure it out by then. And anybody who's not on board is simply not going to get a job. If you are a dissenter, you are ostracized, you are shunned. It certainly happened quite a bit. E.O. Wilson, the father of sociobiology, Philippe Rushton, Mearsheimer and Walt, who wrote the book on the Israel lobby, they've all had huge problems in the academic world as a result of that. I've certainly had a lot of hostility at my university. Helm from Denmark has had a huge problem because of his writings on race and IQ and that sort of thing, sex differences. But when I want to talk about, and we're talking about these different mechanisms, I want to talk about individualism. I think individualism is fundamental to understanding the West. And I should preface this by, this is a work in progress. I think understanding us, Europeans, is the hardest intellectual problem there is. I think, understanding Judaism is sort of simple once you sort of get the idea of, ethnocentric groups and cooperating and so on, and IQ and that sort of thing. It's a very simple kind of thing. But understanding white people and understanding why so many of us are voluntarily committing suicide. I mean, it's not, I don't think it's the case that all the white people that we see, who are supporting this regime are just doing it for their own self-interest or incentivized. A lot of them believe in it. And they have these moral beliefs, and so we have to try to understand why we are doing this to ourselves, because I think this is part of our uniqueness. The basic theory goes back to Fritz Lenz around 1930. By the way, if you cite Fritz Lenz, they will go all over you because he was associated with the National Socialist regime. He was an important geneticist at the time, and he had the idea that there was evolution in the North, in the harsh environment of the ice ages, that the people in Northern Europe were shaped by the evolution in this very harsh environment of the ice ages. In that environment, between group competition wasn't so important. It's not totally unimportant, but ecology did not support big group competition. And you had selection for intelligence. So in the North, intelligence is selected for problem solving, for being able to deal with a very harsh nature. And the idea is that individualism is part of Western uniqueness. That was his basic idea, and I accept that. If you look at the map of individualism, this is not a very good one, but this is, if you look at the scores here, the darker colors are the more collectivist societies. You notice the very light colors are all in Europe, or European-derived societies. And individualism is a creation of Europe. It's part of our uniqueness. If you look at patterns, because individualism is associated with creativity. Individualists are not, don't necessarily follow the herd so much. And so if you look at patents, it's definitely correlated with individualism. More individualist societies have more creativity. So the idea is that part of this is that there was natural selection for pair bonding, love and affection as the basis of marriage, high investment in children. If a man, walked out on his wife and children in the ice ages, it's pretty obvious what would happen. Those children would die. So there was selection for paternal involvement in rearing children. There was also selection for monogamy. You couldn't have 6 wives under these circumstances. The ecology would not possibly support that. So part of my early research was on monogamy, trying to understand why Europeans, despite our sort of advanced culture and advanced economies, tended towards monogamy. No other culture is like that. If you look at China or India or throughout Africa, the Arab world, all those cultures, successful men had many wives. And that was absolutely legitimate. That's not been the case in Europe ever, really. There are some exceptions here and there, but the general tendency has not been that way. On the other hand, with collectivist societies, you have arranged marriages, whereas with individualist societies, you have marriages based on personal attraction. In other words, compatibility, love and affection, personal compatibility, physical attractiveness, and so on are very important, whereas in these other societies, you still see this in the Middle East, so famously with Iraq, Afghanistan, and so on, cousin marriages are the norm. These societies are in Africa. You see these societies are based on cousin marriage, very highly inbred, and that's not good for IQ either, obviously. Whereas in the West, you have exogamous marriage, meaning you're not marrying your close relatives, based more on individual choice, personal attraction rather than kinship, and family strategy. So in a place like Iraq, your family's going to arrange your marriage in order to get the best deal possible. It's not going to be based on personal attraction or anything like that. The basis of marriage tends to be affection, and love is one of the most important aspects of it. But there's also been sexual selection in the North for blonde hair, blue eyes, and so on, sort of like the peacock's tail. These are things that are seen as attractive, and so there was selection for them over the years. And you see far more hair color diversity and eye color diversity in Europe, particularly in Northwest Europe than anywhere else. Other cultures, people look pretty much the same, but there's a lot more diversity in Northwest Europe. It's part of the individualistic thing, part of a matter of attraction to other, personal attraction being the basis of marriage. The other aspect, very important, of individualism is less ethnocentrism. Europeans are less selected, as Fritz Lenz was saying, for between-group competition, more for dealing with adversity. You had the basic nuclear family, mom, dad, and the kids. You don't have these extended families. If you look in the Middle East and Africa, families are really very extended. And they'll have cousins, living together and so on, very extended families. In Northwest Europe, much more of a tendency towards a nuclear family, mom, dad, and the kids. Kinship is on both sides, higher status for women. Women has always had a higher status in Western Europe than in other cultures. You look in the Muslim world now. I mean, this is one of the big conundrums, is why feminists don't object to Muslims coming into the country and setting up Muslim institutions when their attitudes towards women are completely the opposite of Western attitudes. About population genetics, I think very important, this is a very difficult area, and it's changing a lot, but a lot of really interesting recent stuff. Basically, there are three different groups that enter Europe. One were the Western hunter-gatherers that were here from the Ice Age. So this is like more than 8,000 years ago, probably 10,000 years ago when the glaciers receded. The people that repopulated Europe were hunter-gatherers. That means they hunted game, they gathered food. They did not farm. So basically a hunter-gatherer economy. Around 7,000 years ago, you had a group from the Middle East that were farmers, and they had white skin, and they were more influential in the South, and the hunter-gatherers in the South were more dark-skinned. In the North, they already had selection for light skin, blue eyes, and so on, things like that. The third big invasion was the Indo-Europeans, which gave us all our languages. Swedish is an Indo-European language, English, all the European languages, about 4,500 years ago. They came in as this military elite, conquering these various groups. This is a recent paper on that topic. And if you look at the population genetics of Europe now, this is illustrates, as you go north, you see this sort of darker area. They can actually tell which genes are from the hunter-gatherers. Those ancient hunter-gatherers that populated Europe after the Ice Ages, more common in the north of Europe, less common as you go south. The opposite is the case with the farmers' genes. They can type the genes, and you can see they're much more common as you go into the south and as you go towards the Middle East, because they came originally from the Middle East. The thing about hunter-gatherer groups, there's a lot of research on hunter-gatherer groups around the world. They are relatively egalitarian. There's a consensus form of leadership. People just sort of, you don't have big factions. Everybody sort of agrees. You don't have despotism. You don't have one guy, lording it over the others. This is what we call egalitarian individualism, which Mark Webber was talking about as well. No one can rise above the others. And Scandinavia, I think, is a paradigm of this. I've talked to a lot of people about these so-called Jante laws, where you don't think of yourself as better than anyone else. Don't think you are anything. Don't you think you're as good as us. Don't think you're smarter than us. There's a sort of strong egalitarian bent in Scandinavian culture. Christopher Boehm is an archaeologist, is an anthropologist at University of Southern California, and he's studied these hunter-gatherer groups, and that's what he finds, that there's a very strong tendency towards egalitarian social structure in those groups. Personal goals are much more paramount when we're talking about individualism. Socialization emphasizes self-reliance, independence, individual responsibility, and so on. We individualists have more positive attitudes towards strangers. We welcome strangers more readily to our groups than other more collectivist societies, very strong in-group, out-group boundaries. Individual societies, not so much. They don't have strong boundaries. We're more positive attitudes towards strangers. Individuals are more likely to act in an altruistic, pro-social manner to strangers. Actually, a couple of my aunts died in India as medical missionaries. They have the idea that you save the world. They go over there and help people, thousands of miles away who are totally different from you. This is something that Westerners do and nobody else does. And now we see that with, for example, with Haitian babies after the earthquake recently, the flurry of adoption, Haitian babies, and movie stars doing it and so on. Again, that's not something that we see in other cultures. And the point is that this empathy and altruism is not based on kinship. It's more prone to universalism. It's not based on, are you a member of my family, of my kinship group? It's a question of, are you suffering or not? It's far more universalistic. And I want to talk, one of the systems, I think, and let's talk about different psychological mechanisms, is what I call the empathy love system. It is one of the big personality systems. And it is heritable, meaning there is genetic influence. About half the variation that we see in people is genetic, and it's at least half, and the rest is environmental. In this scale here, you go from you're very low on this trait. That's what we call a sociopath. Sociopaths don't care about anybody. They have no ties to other people. These are people who can kill people and then go to lunch. They don't care about. They don't feel guilt or about human suffering. And as you go higher here, these people are still probably pretty cold. Then you have average people. This is a typical bell curve as you see for IQ. But as you go up the positive direction here, people, these are standard deviations, like you'd see in IQ research. People are more warm and they're more affection-seeking. They enjoy close relationships based on love and affection. They are good at establishing cohesive family relationships, nurturing children. It's compartmentalized, meaning that it's not given to everybody. You don't fall in love with everybody. It's directed pretty much at your family. That's normal. It makes a lot of sense. But then when you get up really high in this system, you start to really crave affection. Your empathy and your altruism is less discriminating. It's more universal. People up there are more gullible. They trust others. They see the best in others. We were talking about that last night, that you see that quite a bit in Sweden. They're talking about some woman who invited all these gypsies up to her apartment. He was going to give them food and let them stay or something. Well, they raped her, gang rape. She was gullible. She was trusting. She didn't really realize what was going to happen here. People who are higher in the system, more prone to guilt, more subject to feeling really bad if you let others down. And when you get up at the really high levels, what we call pathological altruism. Pathological altruists are so altruistic that they hurt themselves. These are, for example, women who continue to be married to abusive husbands, to alcoholics who beat them, and things like that. People who will give more than they can afford to charities and so on. That's just really what we call pathological altruism. It's probably very important. And when you look at something like this, not surprising, women are higher on it than men. Women are more prone to valuing love and affection in relationships than men are. And so you really have to there'd be two bell curves, one higher than the other, and women are higher. They have a different bell curve than men do. And it's a rather large difference psychometrically. It's a big difference. It's about as big as the IQ difference between blacks and whites in terms of, psychometrically about the same difference.
All right, for Crusade Radio here, we are listening to Professor Kevin B. MacDonald talking about the psychological mechanism of white dispossession. If you are white, you are already feeling this. They want you to be open. They want open borders. They want you to accept the illegals in here. And you're being robbed of your heritage. But let's go on and listen to Professor. I don't know what happened with Crusade. We lost you for a while. Couldn't get back on. My apologies. Let's go.
And it's an important question whether there are racial ethnic differences. Now, I noticed there's a book out there with some of Richard Lynn's stuff on personality, and some of his writing on personality. Richard Lynn has argued that blacks are more sociopathic, and so that means they're more down on the left side of this dimension. They're not as prone to valuing love and affection and so on. I think he's probably right about that. But the point is that This is an important system in these individualist societies as the basis of marriage. It's more important, and this has been commented on by a number of writers, that it's more important, especially in Europe, than other cultures. So I suspect there are race differences in this trait. The other aspect I want to talk about is that in the 19th century, these racial scientists viewed idealism as a trait of Nordics, that is, having ideals that you strive to attain. These universalist moral ideals were erected, and then you take steps to achieve them. You want to achieve the perfect society. One of the things that really struck me reading American history in the 19th century, you see these utopian communities were very common. And they almost always tended to be from the descendants of the Puritans who came from England, and they would set up these societies. They'd have a blueprint with how it should work, and then they would recruit people into these societies. They would have a sort of utopian, idealistic vision of how society should be run. Again, you don't see that in other cultures. Within the individualistic tradition, morality is defined is not what's good for the individual or the group, but it's a moral ideal, an abstract moral ideal. Kant's moral imperative. Act only according to the maxim that you can, at the same time, will that it be a universal law. Now, it turns out Kant, talking to Ricardo Duchesne, was certainly had racial views, but his philosophy is very, very universal. Very universal. Moral idealism is really about when you have an individualistic society, moral idealism is one way to cement the group together. Kinship relationships are weak. The groups in our society have not been based on kinship so much as they have been what we call moral in-groups. And say that this creates a morally defined in-group, not defined by kinship or ethnicity. Shame and guilt as motivators, internal control. And guilt, actually quite a few people now, I've noticed, Christopher Bain noticed this, the anthropologist, Peter Frost, another anthropologist, has talked about guilt as pretty much uniquely Western. Shame you see around the world. Shame is when the community shuns you and you feel bad about it. Guilt, you don't need anybody around to feel bad for having done it. You feel guilty even though nobody's out there shaming you. You know you committed the crime, and you feel bad about it even though no one's ever going to catch you. That's guilt. And it's noteworthy that all the intellectual movements in the cultural critique were fundamentally moral movements. I think a huge part of the onslaught against the West has been a moral indictment. And so that's why we're constantly seeing stuff about slavery, the history of slavery in America, segregation, the Holocaust, and so on. Moral indictments of the West. Western culture is defective and morally blameworthy. But individualism implies an equality of interest. Everyone has interest. No one has a privileged position. You can't have a group that has some kind of privileged moral status, like the aristocracy or something. They're certainly not going to have a privileged moral status. Western philosophy has always been a sort of veil of ignorance. There's no privileged groups. Whereas if you look at Jewish ethics, it's all about what's good for the Jews, what's good for Jews as a group. And that's always been the case. There's always been an understanding that Jewish ethics is about making the group better. And they would compromise individual Jewish interests if the group benefited. So you couldn't compete with other Jews if there was a monopoly, say. Other Jews could not interfere with that monopoly because it was good for a Jew to have that monopoly. It would be bad to have Jews competing with each other. That was very common in Jewish history. Jewish ethics is fundamentally ethnocentric. Their group has a privileged moral position. So it's very different if you kill a Jew versus a non-Jew from the standpoint of Jewish ethics, or rape or any other crime. So within the West, within these individualist societies, arguments on morality necessarily involve an abstract sense of morality, independent of the interests of any particular individual. Groups have no particular moral standing at all, whereas, as I was saying, collectivist groups are far more likely to privilege their own group. And the Arab proverb, I against my brother and I against my cousin, all of us against the foreigner. In other words, the ethics really is how closely related are you to me? And that's the same with Jewish ethics. Is it good for the Jews? So within the individualist groups, reputation is critical. You have to be seen, kinship is not as important.
This is one of the things I've told you. Dr. Carley got all upset at me because I made the statement, I don't hate the Jews, I kind of admire them. If us white boys had that together, we would own the Federal Reserve, we'd own the Bank of England, we'd own the International Monetary Fund, and things would be better for the people. The Jewish, and you never see a Jew go broke, go bankrupt. They all stick together and help each other. We need to do that too. One of the things that I'm talking about, who's our enemy here? It could be your neighbor here, but he could also be your ally. We have powerful psychodramas here, like Jade, Helm. There may not be anything to it. And we definitely don't want to pick up our guns and go shoot some of our neighbors' kids who are serving in the military, following their orders. We weren't in the right when we went to Vietnam, but our soldiers didn't deserve to be spit on when they came home. We have to be selective on this. And if you think about this, if I'm right here, if I'm what I'm trying to tell you about the whole New World Order, about the banking system, all of that, I tell you, don't believe anything I tell you. Check it out for yourself. Because if you realize that Clay Douglas is right, what I'm telling you is right, this is really happening. This is really happening. We've got international politics here. They want you to be afraid of Russia. They're trying to start a war with Russia so they can sell nuclear weapons, so they can deal with the injured, so they can profit. We have to be able, if you can't talk to your neighbor, your family, and tell them this is what's happening, now we've got to take this into consideration as to how we prepare. Now, they don't want you being independent. They don't want you being self-sufficient. They don't want you loving one another. They want to divide and conquer is the oldest maxim in warfare. And many times, we do it for them. We start infighting, we start blaming each other for this or that. Somebody didn't hold their mouth right, somebody didn't do this, somebody didn't do that, and this is part of the psychological pressure put on us. Again, it's the oldest maxim in warfare, divide and conquer. And so often they go after those who are brave enough to stand up and talk about it. This is what Kevin MacDonald is talking about here. It's a psychological mechanism to make you feel guilty, to make you feel bad, to do this, to do that, so you will stay in line with the herd.
Your reputation is important. If you look at these Indo-European military groups, they were based on competence, on your reputation as a warrior, not on your kinship. Personal honesty, integrity, and so on, upholding the moral norms of the group, and feeling guilt if you transgressed. If you transgressed, something about the moral structure of the group, you would feel guilty. On the other hand, with collectivist societies, the obligations to family outweigh everything, and this is why you see so much corruption in the third world compared to the West. Because in those societies, if you get to a high office, say in Africa, your first obligation is to your family. The first obligation is to your family. After that, There are other things. But in the West, you're not expected. Nepotism has always been against the law. And even though, of course, it happens, it's always been frowned on and something to be guilty about. So you tend to have lower levels of corruption, but a strong emphasis on conformity to group norms. And so I'm trying to, going back in history, looking at Western groups and seeing a lot of parallels with, what we see now. And look at these Puritan groups. It's one of the groups I've been looking at mostly. Huge, social control, stifling conformity. Everybody had to be on page. And they approved of spying on everybody. Everybody, make sure they were sexually doing the right thing or whatever. All this spying on other people, making sure they were on board with the morally. And if you were not, of course, it would ruin your reputation. You were then ostracized and out of the group. In other words, the basis of the group was not kinship, it was reputation. Were you a trustworthy person? Were you honest? Do you uphold the moral standards of the group? That's what's critical. And in the West, this is about what happens when these internal controls are rejected. So if you look at the Puritan societies in America, they sort of broke down, they started breaking down in the 19th century. And some of them continued, certainly, but you had a lot of sort of anarchists, people who, once they got out of these Puritan communities, they let go of all the strictures. And this is from Eric Hoffman's book, The Rise and Fall of Anglo-America. And he points out these very strong individualistic tendencies in 19th century America, early 20th century America, way before, modern, intellectuals got at it. But Benjamin Tucker, unfettered individualism, no prohibitions, free love, free sexual kinds of things. Nobody, mess with me. No invasive behavior. Cultural liberation, freedom from constraints. The 1960s hippies, part of my background in self-discovery, Jade, all these are leftist politics, all those things going way back, as part of the American tradition. You see this now very strong in America, this libertarian tendency, which is intellectually respectable because it's avowedly non-racial, right? If you're a libertarian, everybody's an individual, you're completely atomized, nobody has any social ties. Ron Paul is associated with that people will oppose any kinds of laws, say, on drug. If people want to get high, if they want to become an addict, let them do it, kind of thing. They're opposed to affirmative action, a big thing in America where blacks get a sort of leg up on university admissions or jobs. They're against that because it's a group-based thing. Everybody's supposed to be a completely atomized individual. You see, intellectuals. Ayn Rand is very popular in this group. Her books, Atlas Shrugged, I'm sure you've probably heard of those books. Very strong, plugs into the American tendency of individualism. So what happens when you get out of these very strong, controlled groups like Puritans is they're sort of unleashed, and there's a tendency to accept completely libertarian, individualist points of view. So within the West now we have what we call implicit whiteness. That is, we form groups that, because we're not supposed to be talking about race, right? We form groups with other whites. We move to white neighborhoods. We join clubs that are almost all white, but we can't talk about it. You see that in America with NASCAR, that's the stock car racing group, the Tea Party movement. People are always moving to the suburbs and trying to get away from diversity in America. But they're not talking about that. They're just talking, well, I'm going there for better schools or something like that. They won't talk about race. But the reality is they want to live with other white people. They want their kids to go to school with other white children. That's what we call implicit whiteness. Explicit whiteness is we are white and we have interests. We're talking about it explicitly. The idea here, and this is another mechanism, it's very important, is that the cortex, the higher part of the brain, is able to control the lower part of the brain. And it can inhibit so-called prejudice responses. So in social psychology, they have all these experiments where they bring in subjects and they'll have them, make choices on a computer and video, and they'll say, you have just made a prejudiced response, or something like that. And what happens then is the subject starts really getting nervous, and they start inhibiting, and they start getting real careful, and they inhibit those responses. And the point is that really the way it works is that you have these media messages. Pro-white attitudes are evil. People who have pro-white attitudes are morally defective and stupid and that kind of thing. And those are processed in the higher part of your brain. Those are media messages. We see those. Those then are able to inhibit your natural tendencies towards attraction to white people, to making so-called prejudiced responses and so on. In other words, the way the brain is wired is you have all these inhibitory connections from the cortex to the lower part of your brain. You can control these things. And that is a big part of political correctness, is the fact that we can control the attitudes that are sort of coming from the lower part of the brain. Xenophobia. Even though we're individualists, it's not like we're completely free of these sort of fear or dislike of strangers and so on. Everybody's like that to some extent. Phil Rushton, unfortunately, died recently. He's sort of best known perhaps for his racial differences work, but he also talked about people are attracted to people who are like themselves genetically. And he would actually take measurements of wrist size and so on. If you look at people's friendships, they tend to be with genetically similar others. Well, those produce attractions and so on, but the point is the cortex can inhibit those things. And that's what we see now. That the psychology is seeing things like xenophobia as a challenge. What we have to do is find ways of inhibiting those things. And we know that the brain does work that way, so you can do that. So you have the cortical control of the subcortical feelings. You can inhibit these responses. It's been shown in the laboratory repeatedly, whether it's xenophobia or desire for drugs or sex or things like that. Those are all sort of biologically motivating, but you can inhibit them top down, cortex down to the lower part of your brain. And of course, the media takes full advantage of that. The media is about controlling the cortex. The media is about giving you messages. Whites are evil. The slavery was evil. Why, there's no such thing as race, and so on. And of course, that produces guilt. So again, this is the basic mechanism that we see. The culture critique, certainly one of the big lessons, I think, of culture critique is that human evolution is now being fought out in the realm of ideas. We're fighting over control of the human cortex. And these intellectual movements of the left, particularly things like the moral imperative of immigration and multiculturalism, the decline of evolutionary thinking, the social sciences, Boas, the Frankfurt School, all these things, our general loss of confidence have been major components of the evolutionary disaster. Now, as we wonder, we see all these people coming into our countries, the birth rate of whites is low. That is natural selection against us. That is from a biological point of view, as an evolutionist, when I look at what's happening in the West, we are losing an evolutionary game. And one big part of the reason is that these intellectual movements of the left have been able to control the moral high ground, the intellectual high ground, and produce this kind of mechanism, this inhibitory mechanism. So again, some people are motivated by pathological, strong empathy, altruism, like we talked about before. Other people just inhibit these responses. They know how it works, and they know they would be punished if they won't, but they can inhibit these things. And a lot of them are motivated because of the constant propaganda they're getting. Their cortex is constantly being bombarded with these messages, 24/7, all the time. If you turn on the television, read the newspaper, that's what it's all about. So I want to talk about 3 historical examples The point being that these tendencies go way back in Western history. They're not the result of Jewish intellectual movements. Okay, there's something about us that is being taken advantage of here in the contemporary world, but we can see these tendencies a long time ago. And one example, I've already mentioned the Puritans. The Puritans, I think, are a fascinating group, very important group in American history. They landed in Massachusetts, and they ended up spreading clear across the country to the West Coast. And they're really a very important culturally, dominated the culture of America, I think, in the 19th century, really until the rise of these Jewish intellectual movements in the mid-20th century. If you look at their societies over in England before they emigrated and after they emigrated, relatively small social class differences. Like Scandinavia, by the way, much more egalitarian. You didn't have big hierarchical differences in their societies. They did not have slavery. Slavery never caught on in New England. And importantly, this tendency to pursue these utopian causes framed as moral issues. In other words, moral in-groups. They were trying to create a moral in-group, really, of the whole society. And again, I mentioned before, these utopian communities in 19th century America, very typical of Puritan social structure, that you'd have this idea of we're creating a city on the hill, this golden city, or we're going to have an experimental community, Brooks Farm in Massachusetts. There were quite a few of them. They all failed eventually because they were sort of constructed with these various ideas of mine. They completely ignored human biology. But they tried, and that was a big part of what they were about. And very important, I think, for us is that they're willing to incur great costs to impose moral perfection. If you look at the Civil War, they were willing to sacrifice hundreds of thousands of lives for a moral ideal. They had no problem with that. And they were motivated by a moral idea. You look at the writings of the time, they were the most important group in the United States in opposition to slavery in the 19th century. I'm not, advocating slavery, obviously, but I am saying the Puritans had this moral vision. Slavery was awful, and they were willing to incur any cost to get rid of this evil, even though it was really not in their interest. They're in New England. It really didn't matter what the Southerners were doing with the slaves. It didn't really cost them anything. But for them, it was a moral abomination, and they were willing to incur huge costs in order to get rid of that. They had strong controls within the group. They would spy on each other. In the 17th century England, people go around to other people's houses and look in the windows, report them to the magistrates. If they did anything, adultery or something like that, they would get you and put you in prison and all kinds of things. They had very low levels of criminal violence. You didn't see a lot of murder and mayhem, assault in Puritan communities, but the very high levels of public executions. So they were, executing Quakers, people that were, deviant religiously in some way, and it was public. That is, these people were condemned by the judicial system and as opposed to, criminal violence, street violence, something like that. So the Puritans, very strong sense that people should suffer mightily for their sins. So again, it's the same model here. In this case, ending slavery, establishing the ideal society. Those all come from the cortex. And the philosophers in the 19th century, the transcendentalists, had a very strong, idea that it was about, idealism, that you create ideal societies, and then you try to achieve them. And you even had the idea of suppressing, these lower, more animal-like desires, self-interest, and so on. Of no importance to them. What was important was a moral ideal. The second example is David Hackett Fisher's book comparing New Zealand and the United States. His point about the United States is that in the 18th century, the United States was treated very badly by the British Empire. There was a lot of sort of arbitrary things going on, and there were a lot of sort of laws that would inhibit the freedom of individual Americans. And so the American Revolution was really a reaction to the way they were treated by the British Empire. Whereas in New Zealand, in the middle of the 19th century, by that time, the British Empire completely changed. And it was much more in the direction of this Puritan thing that we're talking about. The most important characteristic of the British Empire at that time was a greater emphasis on social justice and fairness, as opposed to in America, where liberty, personal liberty, was far more important. So that's still a big part of American culture. Personal liberty, for example, being able to have guns, free speech, those kinds of things, very ingrained in America. Not so much in New Zealand, where a sense of social fairness is far more important. But I was very struck by some of the statements. Colonial administrators, a very high level of probity, recruited able and honorable men concerned about justice and fairness, self-consciously trying to uphold this universalistic morality. By the time they came to New Zealand, they wanted to be good. They wanted to convert these people, these natives in New Zealand, to a Christian way of life. They wanted to treat them fairly. They didn't want to have, racial animosity and so on. What is going on here? There it goes. Okay. So, and this is a quote from Hackett Fisher. We see a strong sense of high-mindedness. The British Empire at that time, very high-minded, very moralistic, very idealistic. Here's a bishop there. He's got a lot of examples, but he's a highly principled idealist with a broad ecumenical vision of Christianity, in which New Zealand became linked to an ideal of racial equality. They did not think that they were superior racially to the native New Zealanders, a fierce defender of Maori rights. So these people were moral idealists. The British Empire changed dramatically in the 19th century. Another example from Andrew Joyce. He's a very important writer for the Occidental Quarterly. He's also in the Occidental Observer. He's a PhD in history, and he really writes some very good, articles about a lot of things, especially Jewish history. But he also has written something about English history. This is a quote from his article in Occidental Quarterly. This is about the Morant Bay Rebellion. This is in Jamaica, where these freed slaves killed a whole lot of white people. Gruesome torture, murder, horrible thing. To the clear-thinking individual, it was plainly criminal what these people had done. An unimaginably brutal series of actions carried out for malicious reasons against a population targeted because they were white. This is 1861. And yet there was a faction in England convinced not only that it was the black population that were the victims, but also that their fellow whites were reprehensible monsters who deserved the fate that they received. This pathological response, laden with a misplaced hyper-emotionality, would shake the empire to the core, sapping its confidence, bequeathing a legacy which is felt to this day. In other words, you see these universalistic tendencies back in the 19th century, condemning whites, championing non-whites at the expense of whites. The main warriors in this case that he talks about on behalf of blacks were Christian philanthropists, believed that the races could be raised to standards of education and conduct that would place them alongside Europeans. Members of the group tended to be nonconformist. That means they weren't high Anglican, they weren't Catholic, they were Puritan, Quakers, and so on. Middle class, Methodist, liberal and radical in their politics. Critically interesting from our point of view, they had never traveled outside Britain. They had no experience with these people. And it's just like right now, the people in America who are most liberal are often the people who live furthest away from diversity. We see that as a very common thing, and I've heard that talking to people about Sweden. The last example are Quakers. Again, this is from the late 18th century. And you see all these religious groups, really, the Quakers, the Methodists, the descendants of the Puritans, even later on, the Church of England, all opposing slavery for strong moral reasons. The Quakers are central because they were the leaders of this. They were the ones that provided the money, the organizing, the sort of footwork for the whole thing. Critical importance, and they were champions of liberty for enslaved Africans. They did not do it for themselves. They had no financial interest in this. This was a moral crusade that they were involved in. The religious ideology is the apotheosis of universalism. Everybody is the same. There's ideology. Moral principles are way more important than self-interest. A basic Quaker belief is this inner light of God, shown equally on all humans. And a quote from Anthony Bennett, who's an important American Quaker, is that human equality was an ontological fact. In other words, blacks and whites were absolutely identical. There are no differences of importance. It was not a philosophical doctrine, simply something that was true in the nature of the universe. He freed his slaves. He extended his interest. He tried to help the Native Americans and poor and everything else. The groups were very highly egalitarian, democratic, non-hierarchical. By consent, the policies of the group were based on consensus. They had no bishops, no ordained ministers. Anybody could speak. And just as with hunter-gatherer groups, it was a consensus kind of thing. The Quakers were economically successful. That helped them in their crusade against slavery. And they formed a group apart. They were like, very self-consciously, they were different from other people. They lived together. They wanted a holy nation. They had this moral ideal that they wanted everyone to eventually come to. They wanted all of England to become a moral society. Again, you have the idea of the moral nation, the moral in-group, not based on kinship, but on allegiance to a moral ideal. Dissenters were shunned and ostracized. And, of course, we see that now. People who dissent from the current views on race and immigration and so on are socially shunned. Well, we see that same thing in the Puritan communities. If you couldn't hold slaves, say, and be a Quaker. That would be impossible. They would shun you and ostracize you. And as with the Puritans, very watchful over the morals of others. Everybody was watching everybody else to make sure that they were, on the right page morally. The Friends were appointed to, examine other people. Did a member neglect to attend his means of grace? Was he guilty of disorderly walking? And so on. So everybody was sort of on everybody else, watching everybody else, making sure that they were doing the moral sort of thing. Again, it's very much like we see now, where there's the surveillance, where everybody is sort of watching everybody else, making sure that you are on page with diversity, multiculturalism, immigration, and everything else. This hunter-gatherer ethic that is most strong in the north of Europe implies that one's moral character is the most important aspect of group status. Individuals maintain their position in society by subscribing to moral norms. Fundamentally, the movement to end slavery operated by defining abolitionism as a moral in-group, very much like a hunter-gatherer in-group, not based on kinship, but based on a moral ideal. Those who continued to advocate slavery were shunned as moral pariahs. And again, the basic logic here is that all peoples have to have cohesive groups. The difference is that in Northern Europe, the groups are based on a moral in-group. So that it's not based on kinship, it's based on subscribing to a moral in-group. Moral reputation and trust are critical. They formed a distinctive, ethnically based British subculture. When you look at Britain, it's nowhere near as homogeneous as, say, Sweden was, I think. Britain had a lot of different groups in it. There were Scandinavians that came down. Of course, the Normans conquered. You had the previous existing Celtic groups and so on. And it's interesting that the Quakers did come from Scandinavia. some of the parts of those invading armies in the 8th century, I believe. The predominant region was the North Midlands, colonized by Viking invaders. They prized individual ownership of houses and fields, an aspect of individuals, not collectivism. They spoke Norse into the 12th century. Here's a classic moral statement from a Quaker. He was a very famous Quaker. He opposed slavery, lived humbly, felt guilty about preferring his own children to children on the other side of the planet. In other words, that's an ultimate statement of universalism. To be guilty that you prefer your own children to someone, a child in Africa or something like that. So the Quakers created a moral in-group in which those outside the in-group were seen as immoral, while those inside, they activated these pleasure circuits in the brain for feeling good about themselves, being moral, and so on. And you can see similar tendencies. I didn't write about them as much among the Methodists at that time. Quite a few Anglicans, and as time went on, more and more Anglicans. The High Church of England, and especially with the descendants of Puritans. And as I said before, the Puritans were absolutely central to the anti-slavery movement in the United States. They were.
Now, what Professor Kevin MacDonald was just talking about, we saw on the cover of Newsweek, your major media center here, Newsweek magazine, had a picture of a white baby on the front and wanted you to feel guilty for supporting whites. This is why, and this is what went on in Ferguson. Again, divide and conquer, set the whites against the blacks. I mean, it was the Jews that brought the blacks over here. It was their ships that brought them over here. They profited off of slavery. Of course, it was their own people that sold them out. They didn't stick together the way they should have in their own country, in their own origin. But it was whites that took care of them, that did the plantations, that basically gave them jobs. I doubt that the slaves in the old South were treated very much worse than the workers in the factories here. And the whole Newsweek story with a white baby on there to make you feel guilty about having a family. They did that. The facts are, if a population falls below a certain percentage, it's almost unrecoverable. Those people will be wiped out. And that's happening to you white folks now. They want to call me a racist because I'm talking about this right now. I'm talking to you about it. And I'm telling you that the enemy could be the guy next to you that's bought into this whole thing. We're only supposed to have 1.5 children, you know. It's our duty to only have one child, because they don't want you reproducing at the same rate that the Muslims and the Mexicans are here. The Mexicans and the Muslims are making their living off of their children. It's whether it's communism, whether it's fascism, I don't know, and it doesn't really make a lot of difference. It doesn't make a lot of difference. It's pretty much the same system, but remember, communism was financed and started by Jacob Schiff, New York banker. Federal Reserve, European bankers came over. Some of them were Jewish. Most of them were Jewish. But if I talk about it, somehow I'm a racist. Professor MacDonald has been demonized almost as much as I have, but here he is speaking over
the ones who really, did all the work in that one. Interestingly, the abolitionists framed African slaves as members of a common humanity. They were not a group apart. It's a universal group. Moral universalism was a strong characteristic. Here's a statement by one of them. The point of opposition to slavery was to gain to society, to reason, to religion. I mean, these guys were religious. They wanted them to become Christians. 500,000 of our kind, notice our kind. And he thinks of these African slaves as really us, part of our in-group. Equally with us, adapted for advancing themselves in every art and science. And to think about it, in the 18th century, the huge gaps between European society and Africa. And he was making these statements. Every art and science that can distinguish man from man, equally with us, capable of looking forward and to enjoying futurity. In other words, racial egalitarianism in the 18th century. Again, this is not produced by the culture of critique. This is endemic to the West, something about us. At the time, a big pull. We talked about empathy as another mechanism involved in this. And this picture of a slave ship was brought to Parliament to show the evils of slavery because the slaves were packed in so closely. This is a drawing of an actual slave ship. And so it's pulling for a universalist form of empathy. And you know, the Africans are being exploited here. I was talking last night, and the Swedish Prime Minister saying, open your hearts to the refugees from Africa, from Syria. Open your hearts. That's really what the Quakers were saying. Open your hearts about these people. And that's again, late 18th century. This is a very famous medallion here, polling for universalist empathy. Am I not a man and a brother? A brother. In other words, you're not from a different group, a different continent, a different race. You're a brother. You're the same. You know, again, this moral universalism, very characteristic of European, especially Northern European culture. So in conclusion, Western uniqueness results from two very powerful currents. The hunter-gatherer culture, I think, has been very influential, especially in the north of Europe, persisting through the ice ages, producing egalitarian individualism, exogamy, and so on, representative, non-despotic political culture, but moral conformity and reputation as the basic cement of in-groups and social cohesion. Policing the morals of the group, and now, of course, we see, you know, opposition to racism and so on, opposition to, you know, to any opposition to immigration and all that. All those things are a huge part of being part of the moral in-group. The other aspect I'm not going to talk about today, but is we'll call is more aristocratic egalitarianism, more associated with military elites, produced very different societies. And you can see that within England. That if you go to the south of England, they're very hierarchical, not at all like the Puritans, not at all like the Quakers. Very big differences within Europe. Strongly hierarchical, dominance and subordination, but individualistic in their way. They're not based on kinship as much as you see, say, in the Middle East. And in general, in the recent centuries, egalitarian individualism has consistently won out. Certainly the Civil War in the United States, the English Civil War, and so on, was the victory of the egalitarian universalists. The American Civil War really was the Puritan-dominated North against the South, dominated by these aristocratic planters, cavaliers, very much part of the English aristocracy, a lot of younger sons and so on. Very different kind of ethic there. In America, this culture dominated until the mid-20th century, until the rise of these Jewish intellectual elites that we see, and then the complete demographic transformation of the West, that I think has been the result of that. The Puritan, this liberal tradition was altered. There was a consciousness beginning in the 20th century. You had some elite Puritan-descended intellectuals like Madison Grant, Lothrop Stoddard, who started to get it, that we had to stop immigration, that they started to see Jews as a very bad influence in America, and they started to want to keep them out. But that didn't last. After World War II, it fell apart, and we saw the rise now of this new hostile elite, beginning with the immigration law of 1965. The WASP elite, the white Anglo-Saxon elite in America, was relatively non-ethnocentric. It was easily permeable, and it was overthrown, basically. It is non-existent at this time. So again, all the movements I talk about in cultural critique are moral indictments of the West, very much associated with that. And one of the big things, and Steve Saylor, that you know him, talks about this a lot, that in the early 20th century, Jews were excluded from the Protestant elite. You know, there was a time of ethnic defense. In America, these Protestant elites tried to keep them out, keep them down. And that is like a huge chip on the shoulder of Jews now. They feel that they have been excluded in the past, and they you know, resent that, and it's like a huge hostility towards former elites, which really what white America was all about. So again, what is going on now really is a moral onslaught. The older culture is under moral attack and has been for a very long time now. So my suggestion is that we have to understand this and frame our own ideas in terms of the idea that is morally okay, is morally defensible to defend our own traditions, our own culture, our own people. That this is absolutely normal and it is moral and legitimate. We have to emphasize the costs of multiculturalism that are completely not fair. And what's happening now is mostly it's the working classes that are suffering because they can't move away from this. People with money, and we see this in America, I'm sure we see it in Sweden and elsewhere, people with money move away from it. They can get away. They can put their kids in private school. They don't have to deal with all these problems. But people with not so much money, they have to live in these communities filled with violence, with no cohesion. You don't know who these people are. They have all these foreign customs and so on. One of the findings that the common thing is that people are less willing to contribute to public goods. So as we have more diversity in the United States, people are going to be less willing to contribute to the health care of the society. And it was very hard in America to pass a public health law, which was done under the Obama administration, but the huge opposition by white people because they knew they are going to be contributing to people unlike themselves. They're going to be disproportionately funding the health care of people who are not like them. That is a problem. We have to create our own moral in-groups. We have to have a sense of our own moral legitimacy. We have to shun those who reject that. We have to have a strong sense that we are doing the right thing. And part of this is to make white people more conscious that we are a certain way, that we are that we are unique. Our individualism is unique, and it has certain strengths. We went out and conquered the world. We've invented all these things. We've explored all these things. We really created the modern world. But there are these weaknesses, and we have to make white people conscious that this moral universalism, this indiscriminate empathy, these individualistic tendencies have got to be under control. And we have to realize that they compromise our real interests. And like any other tendencies, they can be blocked by top-down control. We are also fighting for the cortex. We want to convince people of the truth of our points of view and the moral legitimacy of our point of view. Once that happens, we can inhibit these tendencies that are very important to the West, but we have to inhibit the extreme forms of individualism. We have to inhibit the extreme forms of moral universalism that are so destructive to us right now. But that is the way the brain is set up, and I think it can happen. Thank you.
All right, let me clear on that. First of all, you have to stop being ashamed of being white. We've got a good heritage. Next week we'll have on John Nugent to talk about the Solitarians, to talk about a new type of religion, a religion of the individual. And if you think there's something wrong here, you're right. You're right. There's something wrong with the whole setup here. It's designed to fail. Designed to fail. And we have to redesign it. We have to work in our community. If you think we're right here. When we talk about Jade, Helm, when we talk about Russia, when we talk about the Jews have been behind all the civil wars. Get the first edition of the Free American. It's free up on freeamerican.com. You can also click on any of the donate buttons there. Find one that works, and you'll be able to make a donation to CRD Publishing. But read the first restored issue of the Free American. Read Benjamin Friedman telling you this is a Jewish historian that was there around the Second World War, hung out with the Jews, because he was Jewish, and he told you the truth, that this whole Judeo-Christianity thing is a hoax. They want you to believe Jesus is the king of the Jews. Jesus wasn't a Jew. So this is all psychological operation, and it's exposed in the first Free American. Do that. I'm Clay Douglas, freeamerican.com. God bless you. Thank you for listening.
I should take